History is often recorded through great battles, the rise of kings, and the shifting of borders. Yet some of the most profound moments in the human story occur not on a battlefield, but within the quiet, desperate corners of daily life. We look back to the summer of 1518. We find ourselves in Strasbourg, a significant commercial city within the Holy Roman Empire. It was a time perched on the edge of the medieval and the modern worlds. On the surface, Strasbourg was a bustling hub of trade and theological debate. Beneath the surface, however, it was a city deeply troubled. The preceding years had been unkind to the people of Alsace. The early 16th century was marked by a series of devastating hardships that frayed the social fabric. Harvests had failed repeatedly, leading to widespread scarcity of food. Grain prices soared, leaving the poor destitute and hungry. Along with famine came the constant specter of illness. Epidemics swept through crowded urban centers with terrifying regularity. Life for the average person was a precarious balance between survival and ruin. There was also a deep spiritual anxiety. The church held immense sway over the minds of the populace, teaching that misfortune was often a sign of divine displeasure. People lived in genuine fear of sin and the ultimate judgment of their souls. The air in Strasbourg that summer was heavy not just with heat, but with accumulated dread, hunger, and the silent stress of a population pushed to its absolute limit. The phenomenon began in mid-July, under the glaring heat of the summer sun. The historical records identify the catalyst as a lone woman, often referred to as Frau Troffea. There was no prior warning, no obvious cause for what happened next. She stepped out of her home into a narrow cobblestone street and began to move. It was not a performance. It was not a dance of joy or celebration. Witnesses described it as something involuntary, a compulsive rhythmic stepping that she seemed unable to control. Her movements were repetitive and ceaseless. She danced without music, accompanied only by the sounds of the busy city around her. At first, her neighbors likely watched with a mixture of confusion and concern. In the tight-knit communities of a medieval city, unconventional behavior was quickly noticed. Some might have thought she had indulged too freely in drink, while others perhaps suspected a sudden madness. But as the hours passed, the situation grew more unsettling. Frau Troffea did not stop. She continued her solitary movement through the afternoon and into the evening. When night fell, she was still moving. Her body must have been screaming for rest, yet the compulsion to dance overrode the natural need for stillness. By the next morning, she was still on her feet, trapped in a cycle of motion that defied explanation. Her singular ordeal was the spark that would soon ignite the entire city. If Frau Troffea's condition had remained an isolated incident, it might have been recorded merely as a strange footnote in a local chronicle. However, within days, the situation transformed from a personal tragedy into a public crisis. The compulsion to move began to spread. It did not travel like a typical disease through physical contact, but rather through sight and proximity. Others who watched her or who simply lived in the surrounding streets began to experience the same uncontrollable urge. Within the first week, historical accounts suggest that upwards of 30 people had joined her. The streets of Strasbourg, usually filled with merchants, carts, and pedestrians, now hosted an eerily silent troupe of dancers. These were not professional performers. They were ordinary citizens, men, women, and even some younger members of the community. They were bakers, laborers, and housewives, united only by this inexplicable affliction. The sight must have been deeply unnerving for the rest of the population. Imagine walking to the market and encountering dozens of your neighbors trapped in endless repetitive motion, their faces perhaps showing strain or blank exhaustion, yet their limbs refusing to stop. The phenomenon was now undeniable. It was visible in the public squares and main thoroughfares. The sheer number of people involved meant that the city could no longer go about its normal business. Something unprecedented had taken hold of Strasbourg, and it was growing rapidly. As the number of those affected continued to rise, the initial curiosity of the townspeople curdled into profound fear. In the 16th century, the framework for understanding the world was vastly different from our own. When confronted with an event that had no obvious natural cause, the medieval mind immediately turned to supernatural or divine explanations. The sight of so many people acting against their own will, dancing past the point of exhaustion, was interpreted as a terrifying omen. The prevailing fear was that this was a curse. The dancing was so unnatural, so relentless, that many believed it could only be the work of forces beyond human control. The families of those afflicted were gripped by panic. They watched as their loved ones were consumed by the motion, unable to communicate effectively, unable to rest, and unable to return to their normal lives. The fear was contagious, spreading faster than the dancing itself. People began to avoid the streets where the dancers congregated, worried that they too might be seized by the invisible force. The normal social trust that binds a community together began to fracture. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion. The air was thick with rumors and terrifying speculation. Strasbourg was no longer just a city suffering from famine. It was a city under spiritual and physical siege by an unknown entity. The dread of what might happen next paralyzed those who were not yet dancing. Faced with a growing public order crisis, the City Council of Strasbourg realized they had to act. They turned to the most educated men available at the time, the university-trained physicians. These doctors were steeped in the medical traditions of the era, which relied heavily on the ancient Greek theories of the four humors. According to this view, health was a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was the result of an imbalance in these vital fluids. After observing the dancers, the physicians delivered their diagnosis. They concluded that the affliction was a natural disease, not a supernatural one. They stated the cause was overheated blood. The summer of 1518 was reportedly very hot, and the doctors theorized that the intense heat had caused the blood of the afflicted to boil, creating a toxic vapor that affected the brain and compelled the body to move. It was a logical conclusion within the framework of their existing knowledge. They reasoned that the dancing was the body's natural way of trying to burn off this excess heat and expel the sickness. Therefore, the medical advice given to the city council was counterintuitive by modern standards. Do not stop the dancers, instead, encourage them. The doctors believed that if the afflicted could dance continuously, they would eventually exhaust the overheated blood, break the fever, and return to normal health. This medical opinion would lead to one of the most bizarre policy decisions in history. While the physicians offered a naturalistic explanation, the common people of Strasbourg viewed the event through a vastly different lens, the lens of faith. In the early 16th century, religion was not just a part of life, it was the foundation of all reality. The church taught that sin had tangible consequences in the physical world. When disasters like famine, plague, or this strange dancing affliction struck, they were widely interpreted as divine punishment for the collective sins of the community. A specific belief began to take hold among the populace. They believed they were victims of a curse known as Saint Vitus's dance. Saint Vitus was an early Christian martyr, and popular legend held that he had the power to both inflict and cure compulsive dancing. If someone had angered the saint, perhaps through lack of piety, failure to observe a feast day, or general immoral behavior, he might send this plague upon them. This spiritual diagnosis carried a heavy weight. It meant the dancers were not just sick, they were spiritually marked. It added a layer of shame and judgment to their physical suffering. For the community, it meant that the solution lay not in medicine, but in penance, prayer, and appeasing the offended saint. This clash between the medical view of hot blood and the popular belief in an angry saint created a confusing and contradictory environment for everyone involved. By August, the situation in Strasbourg had deteriorated significantly. Historical estimates vary, but some chronicles suggest that the number of dancers may have swollen to several hundred. The presence of such a large crowd of people, ceaselessly moving day and night, fundamentally disrupted the routines of the city. Strasbourg was a center of commerce, dependent on the orderly flow of goods and people. The dancing plague brought much of this to a halt. Market squares, usually designated for buying and selling produce and wares, were taken over by the throng of moving bodies. Crucial thoroughfares were blocked, making travel across the city difficult. The sheer noise generated by the event became a constant backdrop to daily life. It was not the noise of a festival, but the unsettling sound of hundreds of feet shuffling on stone day after day. For the merchants, the disruption meant economic loss. For the city guards, it meant a constant public safety issue that they were ill-equipped to handle. The normal rhythms of labor, worship, and rest were suspended. The city was held hostage by the inexplicable behavior of its own citizens. The strain on the city's infrastructure and the patience of its unaffected inhabitants was reaching a breaking point. The bizarre reality on the streets was fast becoming unsustainable for the functioning of the municipality. The city council, composed of wealthy merchants and guild leaders, bore the responsibility of restoring order. They were practical men facing an impractical problem. Guided by the initial advice of the physicians, who believed the dancers needed to dance it out, the council made a fateful decision. Instead of trying to contain the dancers, they decided to facilitate the movement. The authorities cleared open spaces in the city, including a grain market and areas near guild halls, designating them as areas for the afflicted to congregate. They believed that by concentrating the dancers, they could better manage the situation. But they went further. In a deeply misguided attempt to aid the cure, the council hired professional musicians to play for the dancers. Fifers and drummers were brought in to provide a steady rhythm, under the tragic assumption that music would help the dancers burn off their hot blood more efficiently. They even hired strong men to physically support dancers who were beginning to falter, keeping them upright so they could continue to move. The city was now officially sponsoring the very activity that was tearing it apart. They had created large public stages for the affliction, inadvertently encouraging its spread and ensuring the participants would be pushed beyond their physical limits. The consequences of the council's decision were immediate and severe. The human body is not designed for ceaseless, high-intensity activity lasting for days. The dancers were already weakened by the preceding years of scarcity and hardship. Now, driven by an internal compulsion and encouraged by the official music, they pushed themselves past the boundaries of endurance. Contemporary chronicles recount the grim reality of those weeks. The dancers became icons of profound physical distress. Their movements, initially energetic, gradually turned into a desperate shuffle as fatigue set in. They were soaked in sweat in the high summer heat, suffering from severe dehydration. Their feet, battering against the hard stone of the streets and squares, became damaged and painful. Yet they could not stop. The tragedy was visible on their faces, which registered exhaustion and misery even as their bodies continued to move to the pipe and drum. Inevitably, the physical toll became too great for many. The historical records state soberly that people began to collapse. For some, the strain on their hearts and bodies was simply too much to bear. The attempt to cure the affliction through more dancing had resulted in the ultimate tragedy for a number of citizens, transforming a strange event into a lethal one. The introduction of musicians by the city council created a deeply unsettling atmosphere within Strasbourg. Music in the 16th century was almost always associated with structured events, religious ceremonies, courtly entertainment, or peasant festivals. It was meant to evoke joy, reverence, or celebration. During the plague of 1518, music became the soundtrack to suffering. The sound of the pipes and drums echoed through the stone streets, but it was accompanied by a dreadful visual. The dancers were not smiling revelers. They were grim, exhausted figures trapped in a compulsive act. There was a profound dissonance between the lively rhythms being played and the somber reality of the people moving to them. It was a grotesque inversion of a festival. Observers noted the eerie lack of joy. Where there should have been laughter and conversation, there was often just the sound of the instruments, the shuffling of feet, and the heavy breathing of the afflicted. The music, intended to be a cure, became a relentless taskmaster, driving the dancers onward. This strange soundscape, festive music played for a joyless, desperate crowd, hung over the city, a constant auditory reminder of the crisis that no one knew how to solve. To understand how the dancing plague could spread, we must step outside our modern understanding of psychology and medicine and enter the mind of a 16th century European. This was an era where the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world was porous, or perhaps non-existent. Beliefs were not just abstract ideas, they were potent forces that shaped physical reality. The concept of belief back then carried a weight that is hard for us to grasp today. If a community genuinely, deeply believed in the reality of curses, demons, and vengeful saints, those beliefs could manifest in tangible ways. The fear of St. Vitus was a shared cultural reality in the Rhineland. When people saw Frau Troffea dancing and heard the whispers that it was the curse of St. Vitus, their own deep-seated fears were triggered. In a highly stressed, deeply religious population, seeing the symptoms in others could unconsciously trigger the same behavior in oneself. It was not a conscious choice to join in. It was a powerful shared psychological response to a perceived spiritual threat. The mind, convinced it was under attack by a supernatural force, directed the body to act in accordance with that belief. The dancing was a physical manifestation of a shared collective anxiety. The dancing plague did not occur in a vacuum. It was the product of a specific environment heated to a boiling point by extraordinary social pressure. Strasbourg in 1518 was a pressure cooker. The gap between the rich merchants and the struggling poor was vast and visible. The poor lived in constant insecurity, one bad harvest away from starvation, while the wealthy controlled the city's resources and governance. This deep social inequality created an undercurrent of resentment and hopelessness. When you combine this structural stress with the immediate crises of famine and disease, you create a population that is mentally and emotionally threadbare. Under such intense, prolonged duress, human behavior can become unpredictable and extreme. The dancing can be viewed as a form of collective release valve. When people feel completely powerless over their circumstances, unable to feed their families, unable to stop illness, unable to change their social standing, the pressure must find an outlet. In this case, it burst forth in a bizarre, shared physical compulsion. It was a desperate, unconscious reaction by a community that had reached the absolute limit of its endurance. We cannot overstate the physical condition of the people of Strasbourg leading up to the event. The human body profoundly influences the human mind. A population that is chronically malnourished is far more susceptible to both physical illness and psychological strain. The years preceding 1518 had seen a succession of poor harvests across the region. Grain, the staple of the medieval diet, was scarce and expensive. Bread was often made from inferior, sometimes spoiled ingredients just to fill stomachs. Hunger was a constant companion for the majority of the city's residents. Chronic malnutrition weakens the immune system and affects cognitive function, making people more prone to anxiety, confusion, and despair. Furthermore, the memory of past plagues was fresh. Death was a familiar visitor in almost every household. The uncertainty of life was palpable. No one knew if they would survive the next winter, or if the next sickness sweeping through the city would take them. This relentless physical hardship created a population that was physically vulnerable and psychologically primed for a crisis. Their bodies were weak, their minds were frayed with worry, and their future was entirely uncertain. This was the fertile ground in which the dancing plague took root. As the crisis deepened, a significant fault line emerged between the city's two main sources of authority, the physicians and the clergy. Initially, the secular council had followed the medical advice of hot blood. However, as the dancing continued and people began to die from exhaustion, it became painfully clear that the medical approach was failing. The prescription of more dancing was only accelerating the tragedy. The religious leaders, who had always suspected a spiritual cause, grew increasingly vocal. They argued that this was not a matter of blood and bile, but of sin and sainthood. They contended that the secular authorities were mismanaging a divine crisis. The tension between these two worldviews, the emerging, albeit rudimentary, scientific approach and the established theological approach, paralyzed effective action. The city council was caught in the middle. Continuing with the doctor's advice seemed disastrous, yet admitting it was a divine curse meant acknowledging their own powerlessness. This clash of authorities left the populace confused and without clear leadership. The people saw their leaders arguing over causes while the streets remained filled with suffering dancers. Every explanation put forth during the summer of 1518 was fundamentally shaped by the fears of the age. The theories were not dispassionate analyses. They were desperate attempts to rationalize a terrifying reality. The doctor's theory of overheating blood, while rooted in medical text, was also a reflection of a fear of the uncontrollable human body and the environment. The intense heat of the summer became an enemy that could boil a person from the inside out. The religious theory of Saint Vitus's curse was shaped by the profound fear of a judgmental God and vengeful saints. It reflected a worldview where humanity was constantly on the verge of being punished for its shortcomings. Even the common people's reactions were driven by fear. The fear of contagion, the fear of the supernatural, the fear of being the next one taken by the dance. The entire event was refracted through a lens of anxiety. Reason was largely absent, replaced by reactive theories that sought to contain the fear rather than truly understand the cause. In 1518, fear was the primary architect of reality. By late August or early September, the energy of the phenomenon began to wane. The city council, realizing the catastrophic failure of their musical cure, finally changed course. They recognized that the medical approach had failed and conceded to the religious interpretation. The dancing was decreed to be a spiritual matter. The authorities ordered a pilgrimage. The afflicted dancers, many now weak and injured, were loaded into wagons. They were transported out of the city and taken into the Vosges hills to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus near the town of Saverna. At the shrine, priests conducted a mass. The dancers were given small crosses and red shoes, symbols connected to the saint's legend. They were led in prayers of penance, asking for the saint to lift the curse. It is difficult to say whether it was the change in location, the psychological power of the religious ritual, or simply the natural exhaustion of the affliction running its course, but the dancing began to stop. Over the following weeks, the number of active dancers dwindled. The survivors, battered and weary, slowly returned to their lives in Strasbourg. The strange fever that had gripped the city for 2 months finally broke. By late August or early September, the energy of the phenomenon began to wane. The city council, realizing the catastrophic failure of their musical cure, finally changed course. They recognized that the medical approach had failed and conceded to the religious interpretation. The dancing was decreed to be a spiritual matter. The authorities ordered a pilgrimage. The afflicted dancers, many now weak and injured, were loaded into wagons. They were transported out of the city and taken into the Vosges hills to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus near the town of Saverna. At the shrine, priests conducted a mass. The dancers were given small crosses and red shoes, symbols connected to the saint's legend. They were led in prayers of penance, asking for the saint to lift the curse. It is difficult to say whether it was the change in location, the psychological power of the religious ritual, or simply the natural exhaustion of the affliction running its course, but the dancing began to stop. Over the following weeks, the number of active dancers dwindled. The survivors, battered and weary, slowly returned to their lives in Strasbourg. The strange fever that had gripped the city for 2 months finally broke. Our knowledge of the dancing plague comes from a handful of contemporary sources that survived the centuries. We rely on city council meeting minutes, which record the official decisions to hire musicians and later to organize the pilgrimage. We also have local chronicles written by observers of the time, diary entries from residents, and even sermons delivered by clergy in the aftermath. These records are invaluable, but they are also limited. They were written by men of the 16th century, constrained by the knowledge and biases of their time. The chronicles often focus on the spectacle and the religious implications, rather than clinical details. The numbers they record, such as hundreds of dancers, are estimates that may be exaggerated by fear and rumor. They tell us what people saw and what they believed was happening, but they cannot definitively tell us why it happened in a modern medical sense. We must read these historical documents carefully, understanding them as reflections of a pre-modern worldview, not as objective scientific reports. They provide the pieces of the puzzle, but we must use modern analytical tools to try and assemble them into a coherent picture. In the centuries since 1518, historians and scientists have proposed various theories to explain the dancing plague through a modern lens. One prominent theory involves a biological agent, ergot. Ergot is a mold that grows on rye grain, especially during damp harvests. When consumed in bread, ergot can cause a condition known as ergotism. The symptoms of ergotism are severe and can include convulsions, hallucinations, and muscle spasms. Some researchers have suggested that the people of Strasbourg may have been poisoned by tainted rye bread, leading to involuntary movements that were misinterpreted as dancing. This theory is compelling because rye was a staple food, and the wet weather preceding the event could have favored the growth of the mold. It offers a tangible biological cause for the bizarre behavior. However, many experts argue that ergotism alone cannot explain the event. The symptoms of ergot poisoning are typically debilitating, leading to gangrene or severe seizures that would make sustained rhythmic dancing for days nearly impossible. While food poisoning might have played a role in the general poor health of the population, it is unlikely to be the sole explanation for the specific behaviors observed in Strasbourg. The most widely accepted modern theory is that the dancing plague was an instance of mass psychogenic illness, historically referred to as mass hysteria. This is a phenomenon where cohesive groups of people, under extreme stress, begin to manifest similar physical symptoms that have no organic cause. It is a testament to the overpowering influence of the mind over the body, As we have established, the people of Strasbourg in 1518 were existing under almost unbearable strain: famine, disease, social inequality, and deep spiritual terror. In this pressure cooker environment, the culturally entrenched belief in the curse of Saint Vitus provided a template for behavior. When one person broke under the pressure and began to dance, it triggered a subconscious recognition in others. Their minds, seeking an outlet for extreme anxiety, adopted the physical symptoms they associated with the feared curse. The dancing was a shared, unconscious performance of their collective distress. It was a real physical experience for those involved, but its roots were psychological and social, driven by shared beliefs and shared suffering. 500 years later, the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most haunting episodes. It is easy to look back with a sense of modern superiority, dismissing our ancestors as superstitious or ignorant. But to do so is to miss the profound lesson this event offers. The people of Strasbourg were not so different from us. Their brains were wired the same way. They felt the same basic human emotions of fear, hope, and despair. What happened in Strasbourg is a stark reminder of human vulnerability. It demonstrates that when ordinary people are subjected to extraordinary and prolonged pressure, when their basic needs are unmet and their future is uncertain, their behavior can fracture in unpredictable ways. It shows us the immense power of shared beliefs to shape physical reality, for better or worse. The dancing plague was not just a historical oddity. It was a very human response to an inhumane set of circumstances. It stands as a quiet testimony to the fact that under the right combination of fear and stress, the rational world can quickly dissolve, revealing the fragile psychology that lies beneath.